If you would, please open your Bibles to the book of John, John chapter 4 and verse 48. It is both a sobering thought and a wonderful thought that He is in our midst. It really changes the context of what we do here, changes the context of everything that we say, to know that the Lord is with us this day. He hears the praise that we offer Him. He hears the prayers that we pray to Him. He sees each one of us. He is glorified as we glorify Him. And as we talk about things concerning Jesus Christ, we are giving Him the preeminence in our lives, in our service, and everything that we do. For those that are visiting with us, we are grateful that you have set the priority to come and be with us so that we can worship the Lord together. 5th century BC, there was a man named Siddhartha Gautama who lived in India. He was a Hindu, but he was not satisfied with the Hindu religion, and so he sought out to find the truth. He went through a lot of different ways to try to find that, but it wasn't until he sat for 7 days under a fig tree that it came to him, the truth. From that point on, he was no longer to be called Siddhartha. He was to be called Buddha, which means enlightened one. Was he? In the 6th century A.D., there was a man named Muhammad. He was born in Mecca, Arabia. And when he was about 40 years old, he claimed to receive messages from God, revelations from God. He claimed to be a prophet. I don't know that he ever made the claim himself, but his followers say that he was the last prophet and the greatest prophet. Was he? Historically, in between those two was another man, Jesus, born in Bethlehem in Judea. He also made great claims for himself. In fact, we looked at some of those claims in our lesson last week when we you want to forward my slide here for me, if you would, please? He made claims for Jesus made claims of himself in his relationship with God, that he was from heaven, that he revealed God, that he was eternal, that he was the Son of God. In his relationship to man, he said that he was the Son of Man, he was the Messiah, and he was King. These are amazing claims. In fact, I would have to say, in regards to Buddha, in regards to Muhammad, these claims surpass their claims. Are they true? How do we know what claims are true? What I would like for us to do in our lesson this morning, and apparently this isn't working, so if you wouldn't mind, next slide please. What we'd like to do in our lesson this morning is to look at some testimony that demonstrates that Jesus says, what Jesus said is in fact true. And we'd like to focus in on miracles. If you would click it 3 times for me, please. There are 3 words that are used for miracles. The word miracle is from a word dunamis, from which we get the word dynamite, that emphasizes the power behind the miracles, the events that Jesus was able to perform here on the earth. It's not found in the book of John. A second one, and let's read John chapter 4 and verse 48. Jesus said to him, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe." He uses 2 words here, signs and wonders. The second word, wonder, is a word that emphasizes the reaction that people have when they see a miracle, that when they see this event. They are in awe, they are in wonder, they are in amazement. It's only used 1 time in John. The other word that is used here by Jesus is the word sign. It's used 17 times in the book of John. And it emphasizes, in reference to the same event, it emphasizes what we see from the event, what we see from the miracle, what we learn from the miracle. John is a gospel, and we're going to be focusing in on the Gospel of John. John is a gospel that focuses in on evidence for Jesus Christ being who he claimed to be. Evidence, signs that he in fact is all that he claimed to be in relationship to God and relationship to man. Now, it's interesting that if you look at Matthew, for example, he records 27 miracles of Jesus. Mark records 22 miracles of Jesus. Luke records 31 miracles of Jesus. John records 7 signs, miracles of Jesus. These signs of Jesus, even though there are fewer, are given in a great deal of detail, and I think one thing unique about John is he gives us details that demonstrate that these are indeed real. These are actual events, and these are evidence, true evidence, authentic evidence that Jesus Christ is in fact the Son of God. So I would like for us in our lesson this morning to go through these 7 miracles so that we can see the evidence that in fact Jesus is who he claims to be. The first one, and if you would click it one time. If you would go to the book of John, the 2nd chapter, we find Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and here he performs a miracle. We'll begin reading in verse 1, John chapter 2 in verse 1. On the 3rd day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and the disciples were invited to the wedding, and when they had run out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour is not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." And there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water," and they filled them up to the brim. So this is an occurrence in Jesus' life. We know the place where this occurs. This occurs in Cana of Galilee, an actual city in this area of Galilee. It's a particular time, a particular event in his life. It was at a wedding feast, and this miracle that he's going to do where he turns the water into wine, he gives the information for us that there were 6 water pots in verse 6 of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. He tells us exactly how much water, how much is going to be turned into wine, 120 to 180 gallons. Now notice that Jesus never touches the water. The disciples of Jesus never touched the water. The idea of doing this miracle is not planned by Jesus. It is something that is suggested by the mother of Jesus, by Mary. He asks the servants to fill up the water pots with water, and notice in verse 7 it says that they filled them up to the brim. There's no way that someone is going to sneak in some sort of solution that's going to change this. It's a huge amount of water. They are filled up to the brim, and it's individuals that are not interested or not invested in Jesus who are doing the filling of this water. They fill it up to the brim. Verse 8, and he said to them, "Draw out now," in other words, the servants were to draw out the water, "and take it to the master of the feast," and they took it. Again, Jesus never touches it, disciples never touch it, the servants are the ones that are doing the drawing and taking it to the master of the feast. Verse 9, the master of the feast had tasted the water that had been made wine and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew. The master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then that which is inferior, but you have kept the good wine until now." The master is a bystander in this miracle. He does not know where the water came from. He does not know what words Jesus has spoken. He is an observer in this. He takes of this wine, he drinks it, and he even pronounces the quality of the wine to be extremely good. It's the best wine that they have had so far in this feast. This is a verifiable miracle. There are details given to us here, given to us by John to help the skeptical mind, to help the mind that needs information to know whether or not this is just some trick or whether or not this is just some exaggeration or some myth. John gives us details, gives us information so that we know that this is in fact a miracle. If you had looked at this wine just after the master had tasted it and examined that wine, it would look like wine that took a long time to produce. You have to have seed, you have to plant the seed, the seed has to grow into a vine, the vine has to produce some fruit, the fruit has to be harvested, it has to be smashed into the grape juice. There's a process, there's time that takes place. But Jesus spoke it. Water turned into wine instantaneously. Jesus has power over nature. Yes, the claims of Jesus are extraordinary, but the signs of Jesus are extraordinary as well. And the reaction to this sign, verse 11, this beginning of the signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested His glory, and His disciples believed Him. It produced belief in those that were witness to this miracle. John chapter 4, the next miracle we have, is in the same place. Some events take place in between now, the first miracle and the second, that we're going to skip over. But in verse 46 of John chapter 4, it says, "So Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee, where He had made the water wine, and there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum." Now, John gives us information that this man was from Capernaum, click it once please, which is on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus is in Cana of Galilee. Both of these are actual places in real time, a real place in the history of the world. Jesus is in Cana, and this ruler of the synagogue has come from Capernaum. There's about 12 miles in between Capernaum and Cana of Galilee. We continue here in verse 47. When he heard that Jesus had come out of Judah into Galilee, he went to him and implored him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. One interesting note is just how accurate the Bible is. It says that to come down to Capernaum, if you look on the map, it would actually be going over in a slightly north, slightly up to Capernaum. But in actual typography of the land, Cana is up on a shelf, whereas Capernaum was down very low, kind of in the bowl that would form the Sea of Galilee. They physically had to go down in order to go to Capernaum. This is a real authentic event that John is recording for us. He is an eyewitness of this event and telling us the details of what happened. This man comes because his son is at the point of death. Verse 48. Then Jesus said to him, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe." The nobleman said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Jesus said to him, "Go your way. Your son lives." So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. Notice Jesus does not travel the 12 miles. He does not have any physical contact with his son. He stays in Cana. He speaks the word, and the man goes and returns home to his child. We continue in verse 51. And as he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, "Your sons live." Now notice that the servants don't know what Jesus has said. The servants begin to travel because the son becomes better. There's no cell phones at this time. There's no video chatting. There's no Skype. There's no way for word to get from Cana to Capernaum that Jesus has said anything. But the servants begin to travel. They meet this man in the middle somewhere, and they say, your son lives, verse 52. Then he inquired of them the hour when he got better. And they said to him, "Yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him." So the father knew that it was at that same hour that Jesus had said to him, "Your son lives." And he himself believed, and his whole household. This young man was healed by Jesus when Jesus was not in the room. Jesus was not in the vicinity. Jesus was 12 miles away. At the exact time that Jesus spoke the words is the time that this boy got better. Now, it doesn't say that he had to go to Jesus for several healing events. You know, that's what the faith healers or the fake healers do today. Well, you're going to have to come back again because you're a little bit well and a little bit weller and a little bit more and more and more and more. Immediately, this young man was cured of whatever disease he had. He was recovered to his health again. And it was evidence, it was extraordinary evidence, that in fact Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God. Next slide, please. John chapter 5. Very next chapter, we have the third event recorded for us. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, there was in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, a pool, which is called in Hebrew, Bethesda, having 5 porches. And in these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. Now, John tells us about this place, this event that's going to take place in this Bethesda, this pool, this place that's near Jerusalem. And in fact, you can go to this place today, and this is a picture of what archaeologists have uncovered, these pools of Bethesda. This was a real place in real time. Next slide, please. Jesus goes down into this pool, and of course this is an artist depiction of Jesus going into this pool. Jesus goes down and he finds this man among the sick and the lame who needs to be healed, who is sick. Verse 5. Notice the details given to us. Now, a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. Why does John tell us that? He wants us to know that this is authentic. This isn't someone who has a psychosomatic illness, who is some reason in his head thinking he's sick, some reason he's just not feeling up to it, he's just not feeling good, and Jesus makes him feel a whole lot better. This is a man who is sick 38 years. He's wanting to be healed. He's laying here at the pool of Bethesda. He believes that there's some power in the water. Verse 6. When Jesus saw him lying there, and he knew that he had already been in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" Notice the response of the sick man, verse 7. Sick man answered and said, "Sir, I have no man to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am coming, another steps down before me." He doesn't know who he is talking. He doesn't say to Jesus, "Yes, Jesus, heal me. Yes, I believe in you healing me." He doesn't have any faith in Jesus. He doesn't know, apparently, who Jesus is. He's concerned about getting in the water. I want to get in the water to be healed. Jesus says in verse 8, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk." And immediately the man was made well. He took up his bed and walked. Immediately this man had not walked for 38 years. I don't know about you, but I have been injured before. Broke my thumb one time and had it in a cast, and it was on there for 6 weeks, and afterward there wasn't much muscle there. You know, it didn't work right. It took a while to start working. Could you imagine? You haven't walked for 38 years. What your muscles would be like? Immediately. This is not just a miracle of healing the lameness. This is a miracle of the strength. It's a miracle of the coordination. It's a miracle of the physical therapy that was necessary in order for this man to be able to walk. And it was immediately. The man didn't even know who Jesus was. In fact, they go through the Pharisees, they go through a discussion with this man about, well, who was this and how did this happen? He doesn't even know who Jesus is. This is an extraordinary miracle that was wrought on this man. Jesus had power over diseases. The feeding of the 5,000, the next please. In chapter 6 we find Jesus. We'll pick up the reading here in verse 5. This takes place near the Sea of Galilee. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that everyone may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." But there was much grass in that place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. Now, again, notice the detail that John is giving to us here. Number one, the disciples, the apostles of Jesus, have no idea what he's about to do. This is not some trick that they've orchestrated ahead of time. Jesus knows what he's going to do, but no one else knows what he's going to do. He gets an inventory of what's there. Gets an inventory about how much money they have. They have an inventory about how much food is there. It says, next slide please, that there are 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. That's it. It tells us not just that, well, there was a whole lot of people there. 5,000 men were there, plus the women and children. It gives an idea. Now, if you have 5 loaves and 2 fish, that would be something like what is represented here. How would it do in a group of us? Do you think we could all eat lunch on 5 loaves and 2 fish? Maybe if we each had a little crumb, we would do that. What if there were 5,000 men plus women and children? 5 loaves, 2. How far is that going to go? We have details here that's given to us to help us to set the stage, to see that this is authentic. We continue our reading here in verse 11. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish. Notice this detail that John gives us, as much as they wanted. Verse 12, notice the next detail. So when they were filled, it wasn't that each one had a little bit of crumb. Each one had some. They had enough, as much as they wanted. They were filled. This was a multiplication, an extraordinary, a supernatural multiplication of this food. And then Jesus says, notice the detail that John gives us here, gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost. Therefore, they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. There was more food at the end of this process than there was at the beginning. 12 baskets full of the 5 barley loaves. Now notice there's no fish left over. John gives us a lot of details here. Of the 5 loaves, there are 12 baskets left over. This was an authentic miracle. This was supernatural. This was extraordinary. For this one named Jesus, he has power over quantity, he has power over time, he has power over nature. Verse 14, then those men, when they had seen the sign, again, this is a sign, this is a neon blinking sign that's saying something, it's saying something. What's it saying to us? It's saying that Jesus is who he claims to be. It's saying that Jesus is he makes extraordinary claims. And this miracle demonstrates it. It is a sign that he is extraordinary. They come to the conclusion that this is truly the prophet who has come into the world. It's interesting in the same chapter in verse 66, after Jesus gives him some very hard teaching, it says, and from that time many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. There was more to believing in Jesus than just seeing the miracles. It was also accepting what he had to say. That's really 2 different things. It's one thing for an individual to see the authentic miracle and to say it's extraordinary. It's nothing for people to say, therefore I will submit to your will. And there's where the real difficulties sometimes come in. And these individuals, even though they were eyewitnesses, were unwilling to do so. Very same chapter, we go to chapter 6 and verse 16 and following. We have the next example or the next miracle that we have. It says in verse 16, and when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. So this is right after feeding the 5,000. They're near the Sea of Galilee. They go down to the sea. They got into the boat, verse 17, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. Now it was dark, and Jesus had not come. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing, and when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. It says that they went down to the Sea of Galilee. Now, John doesn't tell us exactly where Jesus fed 5,000, but it's on the other side, on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And it says that they go down into a boat at the sea, and they go toward Capernaum, and they row about 3 or 4 miles. Now, that part of the Sea of Galilee is about 5 miles wide. John, remember who John is? He's a fisherman. He's fished on this lake. He knows what the Sea of Galilee is. He knows how to measure time and measure distance. They have rowed 3 or 4 miles, and they see Jesus coming on the next slide, please. Is an artist's depiction perhaps of Jesus. It says that there was a great wind. Again, more detail given to us by John. And they see Jesus walking on the water. Now, if you're out in the water 3 or 4 miles, there's not going to be somebody able to balance himself on a log and get himself out there so that it looks like he's on the water. There's not going to be somebody who's on a sandbar somewhere that's walking along on a sandbar 3 or 4 miles out into the sea. There is not a natural explanation for this. John gives us details so that we know that it is an authentic miracle. It is supernatural. Jesus is extraordinary, and he demonstrates that over his power to something as basic as gravity. Jesus is in fact the Son of God. The next miracle that we have recorded for us is in chapter 9. We have a man who was born blind. It says in chapter 9 in verse 1, "Now Jesus passed by. He saw a man who was blind from birth." Notice the detail that is given to us here. This is not a man who had some traumatic something happen to him a couple of months ago that psychologically caused him to not be able to see, to be blind for a period of time. That happens to people, and they can get over this. It's not some disease that took place at some point in time in his life. He was born blind. The man has never had the capacity with his eyes to be able to see the world around him. Now the disciples begin to ask some questions about who had sinned and so forth, and we'll skip all that and jump down to verse 6, where it says, "And when he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay of the saliva and anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and he said to him, 'Go wash in the pool of Siloam,' which is translated sent. And he went and washed and came back seeing." Now, this is an authentic place in Jerusalem that we have this event taking place. This is an artist's depiction of perhaps what Jerusalem would have been like in the first century with the city of David here in the forefront and the temple there at the top of the slide. And there was a road that went from the temple down to the pool of Siloam. And Jesus tells this man, there near the temple, to go down to the pool of Siloam and wash there. And when the man goes and washes there, he came back seeing. Next slide there. If you go to the city of Jerusalem today, you will find that this pool of Siloam has been unearthed. And this is an artist's depiction of what the pool would have looked like in that day. The next slide, please. Jesus takes, and this is an artist's depiction of what perhaps Jesus does, he takes saliva and mixes it with clay and puts it on his eyes. I don't know if he puts it on the eyelids, as this depicts, or actually on his eyeballs, but he nonetheless does this to the man, tells him to go wash in this pool, and the man goes and washes in the pool, and he comes back seeing. Now, notice, John's going to give us a lot more detail here, and we'll just notice a few things here. Notice in verse 9, some said, "It is he." Others said, it is like him. He said, "I am he." In other words, there was some confusion. Was this really, was the guy that was born blind that has been here begging all of this time at the temple? Maybe it's somebody else. Maybe it just looks like him. The man says, you're looking at him. I am he. I am the one who was born blind. He is identifying himself. Well, how was your eyes open, they said in verse 10. He answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and I washed and I received my sight. And they said to him, where is he? He said, I don't know. The man doesn't know that Jesus is the Christ at this point. He doesn't know that Jesus is the Son of God at this point. He says it's a man named Jesus. Where is he? I don't know where he is. Well, a little bit later in the context here, verse 24 and 25, the Pharisees continued to ask him questions. They called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. We know that this man, speaking of Jesus, is a sinner. He answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. Again, the man doesn't know who Jesus is yet, but he knows the fact that he could not see before, and now he is able to see. Now when Jesus comes and talks to him in verse 35 and says, do you believe in the Son of God? The man says, I don't know who he is to believe in him. Jesus says, I am the one, in verse 38, Lord, I believe. The man who could not see was able to see the sign, see the neon sign that was in front of him. Jesus was Lord. Jesus is the Son of God. Next one, please. The last miracle that's recorded for us in the book of John that Jesus performs, except for his own resurrection, and I don't want to minimize that, but we won't be looking at that particularly today, is in the 11th chapter of John. John chapter 11, we find John giving us details that lead up to this miracle as well in verse 1 of John chapter 11. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. Jesus heard that. He said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be gloried through it. Jesus knew what was going to happen. Now, Jesus loved Mary, or Martha, and her sister, and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. The details are fascinating that John gives us. He tells us exactly who this is, Lazarus. He tells where he is. He is in this city of Bethany. He tells us who his sisters are. He even wants to make sure that he identifies who these sisters are so that we know these are actual people in actual real time. This is an event that took place in the life of Jesus. Jesus knew what was going to happen, and it said that he waited 2 more days after he heard about the sickness before he even begins to travel to Bethany. But he does, in fact, travel to Bethany, verse 17. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Jesus purposely stays longer before going to Lazarus to make it evident, to make it absolutely sure that this man is dead. In fact, we jump ahead a little bit in the story to verse 38 and 39. Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he is already dead 4 days." This man is dead. He smells. He smells of death. He's been dead for 4 days. Jesus wants to make sure that this man is dead. He wants to make sure everyone knows that this man is dead. And then he goes to the tomb. And he says in verse 34 or 43, Now when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, Loose him and let him go. He called out, Lazarus, come forth. Immediately, Lazarus' life comes back into the body and is able to come out. And notice he comes out. What would you expect a man who has been dead for 4 days to look like when he comes out? All showered and clothes all neatly pressed, and comes out and ready to have a party because he's alive again? No, you would expect him to come out all wrapped up in his grave clothes. And that's the way he comes out. And Jesus has to say, let him go. Loose him. Unwrap him from these grave clothes. This is a man who was dead, who is alive again. This is extraordinary. And this is the way that it happened in history. But it's amazing that this is the last one, the seventh one, the complete one, the perfect one that John records for us, because all of these miracles are extraordinary. But for a man who was dead for 4 days to be made alive again is extraordinary. I heard about a man who was traveling the country claiming to raise people from the dead, and he had a tent meeting and had people come from all over to see he was going to raise someone from the dead. And he had a man there in a casket, and he was getting all worked up, and he was going to perform this great miracle. He was a gospel preacher. I don't know his name. Perhaps some of you have heard this story as well, who was there in attendance at that meeting, who had a gun, who said, now before you raise him, let's make sure he's dead. And the man gets up and runs off. He wasn't dead. Lazarus was a dead man. He was stinking. 4 days he was dead. Jesus said, Lazarus, come forth. And the man stands up, comes out, he's alive again. And he even continues to live for some time after that. Extraordinary event, because Jesus made extraordinary claims, and he wants us to believe those. Now I go back to the introduction. Buddha made extraordinary claims. How many miracles did Buddha do? 0. 0. Muhammad made extraordinary claims. How many miracles did Muhammad do? 0. None. Nothing to bolster his claim. Jesus made extraordinary, I would say, claims above that of Buddha, above that of Muhammad. What did Jesus do? Miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. In fact, John tells us at the end of his book, in John chapter 20, that he has recorded these things for this purpose. In verse 30 and 31, John chapter 20. And truly, Jesus did many other signs. Again, there's our word, signs, blinking signs, saying something to us in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you may have life in your name. It's not just an intellectual exercise that we believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. It is a belief that is going to lead us to a transformation of life, so that we, spiritually who are dead, may be alive again because of the great power and the blood of Jesus Christ. I would encourage you, if you're not a Christian in the audience this morning, to recognize who Jesus Christ is. He is the Son of God. And there's even more testimony that we'll look at in further lessons that to substantiate that fact. If you're not a Christian, we'd encourage you to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and based upon that, change your life. Give your life to Him. Repent of your sins. Confess His name. Be baptized. Born again, so that you could have new spiritual life in Him. If you're not a Christian, please come to Him this morning. If you are one and for some reason have forsaken this Lord, come back to Him this morning while we stand and sing.